Welcome back. Last week we talked about...
We?
Okay, I talked about realism and naturalism. This week we are going to cover regionalism and rags to riches stories, two more phenomenon of the Gilded Age. But first, a general question. What was the most important event of the 19th century?
Your birthday?
Very funny. No, in fact, it was the Civil War. After such radical upheavals, a common human tendency is to develop nostalgia for the earlier, seemingly more innocent era. And while major changes don't take place from one day to the next, one can still say that the U.S. before the Civil War was a largely agricultural nation, and afterwards more and more a primarily industrial nation. Put these two together, and you have one explanation for the rise of regional literature in the U.S. People were yearning for a more innocent, more simple time. And, as industrialization and urbanization began to lead to a more uniform lifestyle across the country, people started to realize what they were losing in the process. For example, this is when people started collecting Indian tales and recording their languages. You don't know what you've got till it's gone. It's a lot like the phenomenon of globalization today and our reaction to it. One example of this in literature is Huckleberry Finn. Much of the appeal comes from nostalgia for the bygone era of steamships and the frontier. Another example are the Uncle Remus stories by Joel Chandler Harris. Published in 1882, the tales were a series of stories told by Uncle Remus, an old former black slave, to a young white boy. The grandfather figure of the former slave serves as a link to the past, to the plantation lifestyle, and a time when blacks were in their place in the social hierarchy, at least in the view of many whites.
Sounds kind of like that Uncle Tom story.
Exactly. It's a combination of an old black man and a young white child. That has a long tradition in American culture. The black is old, and therefore non-threatening, and seems to know his place. But the really interesting part is the stories he tells, which are all about Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox, animal trickster figures from African American folk tales. Slaves loved these stories about the supposedly dumber animal fooling the supposedly smarter one, and they understood the relationship to their own situation. The stories come from oral traditions in Africa, though used with different animals. But I'm sure you are already familiar with this tradition too. These animal tricksters are the direct relatives of various cartoon characters developed in the 20th century.
At least I understand Bugs Bunny. I tried reading the Tar Baby story and it was pretty difficult.
That's another aspect of regionalism, the use of dialect in the story, no matter what part of the country it is from. It is meant to add a touch of realism to the story. But it can also be subtly racist. While Mark Twain had all of his characters speak in their own different dialects, some writers have only some characters supply the local color. The outsider figures will speak a more standard English. In this way, the reader can identify with the outsider. But our common human tendency is to look down on people who speak differently. But regionalism is not just about race or social class or the South. It's about all the regions of the country outside of New York, which by then had become the publishing and cultural capital of the nation. Other writers considered regionalist, at least to some degree, are Kate Chopin for the Cajun country in Louisiana, Willa Cather for the Plain States such as Nebraska, Hamlin Garland for the upper Midwest and places such as Wisconsin and Minnesota. And there's Mary E. Wilkins Freeman for rural New England, Bret Harte for the California Gold Rush country, Jack London for Alaska, and of course Mark Twain for the antebellum Mississippi River country.
I gotta know all these people?
For the test, you really only need to know those writers we've actually read for the seminars. But it's still interesting stuff.
Yeah, right.
But for a quick change here, let me ask you, who was the best-selling American author of the 19th century?
The guy who wrote about the priest?
That Stowe lady.
No, it was Horatio Alger.
Horatio who?
Horatio Alger. He supposedly sold around 20 million copies of the many novels he wrote, of which today all but 3 are out of print. Born in 1832, Alger was a failed Unitarian minister from Massachusetts who turned full-time to writing after the Civil War in order to support himself. At a time when the publishing industry was exploding and dime novels were extremely popular, Alger developed the rags to riches story and found tremendous success with novels like Ragged Dick.
Ragged what?
No, it's not what you think. These are all boys' stories and tell the formulaic story of a poor boy who goes to the city, tries his best to survive and live virtuously, fails, but tries again, sticking to the virtues of hard work and honesty, and finally succeeds. There are variations on the theme. Sometimes the poor boy is an immigrant, sometimes from the countryside. Someone, sometimes a woman, will cheat and trick him. The villains are usually wealthy people. The appeal of such stories during the Gilded Age is, on the one hand, that it is based on the Benjamin Franklin tradition. You do remember his story, don't you? And during a period of rapid urbanization, there is the problem of how you maintain the traditional values in this new environment. The values Alger preaches in these stories are all middle-class Protestant values. Social cohesion is a problem during this era. In New York City, where Alger lived as a writer, some 6,000 boys were living on the streets. Transferring rural values to the new urban settings under such conditions is an issue. Finally, there were real-life models for these rags-to-riches tales. John Rockefeller was the son of a con artist and vagabond who worked hard as a young man and founded what is now Standard Oil. He was one of the richest men in America. Cornelius Vanderbilt rose from the working class to establish a railroad empire in the 19th century. And Andrew Carnegie, son of a weaver, immigrated to the U.S. from Scotland at age 12, went to work in a cotton factory, and eventually became a wealthy man in his 30s, and then the owner of Carnegie Steel, one of the largest steel producers in the world at the time. But we'll talk more about Carnegie later. He's an interesting figure in the later developments in the Gilded Age.
So if this Alger guy's books are all out of print, why do we have to learn about him?
Admittedly, the books aren't all that great to read, but the ideas behind the rags to riches stories are the stuff of dreams, the American dream to be exact. Even today, Horatio Alger's name is a byword in American popular culture. It has captured the American imagination, and you'll find plenty of politicians trying to cast themselves into that narrative. But enough for today. We'll be back next time to talk more about Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth and progressivism as we finish off discussing the Gilded Age. See you then.